Pay close attention. The news you're about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yishmael Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, we have India and Pakistan reigniting some old tensions there, which have brought up the concerns for nuclear war, being that both those countries are nuclear powers.
Right next to each other.
So we'll have those details, and also we have Russian President Vladimir Putin making his State of the Nation address. We'll talk about those issues that he brought up, and also the latest on the Venezuela crisis, including them making a big move to take their oil company and move it to a different location to try to keep it out of the hands of the U.S.
Interesting.
Well, but first we're going to talk about a Middle East trip that has been in the making for some time now, involving Jared Kushner and U.S. Special Envoy Jason Greenblatt. Now, the plan is to tour 6 Gulf countries in 7 days, which include Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Now, the goal of the U.S. delegation is to outline the economic elements of the peace initiative that is aimed at ending the decades-old Arab-Israeli conflict.
Some believe the purpose of Kushner's visit to the Gulf states is to keep the momentum going from the Middle East summit that just ended a few days ago in Warsaw, Poland. Their Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with Israelis and Arabs, excluding Palestinians, to try to form an alliance against Iran.
Marwan Bashara, senior political analyst at Al Jazeera, explains it's important for any American initiative in Palestine to be supported by the Arab world. Guess what? There isn't much left of the Arab world. Now, most of it is either in conflict or at war. 2 of it, Jordan and Egypt, already have peace agreements with Israel, and 3 or 4 of them will never have agreements with Israel at this point, like Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and so on and so forth. So the only thing left is the Gulf countries, he says.
Well, in focusing on the Gulf states, Mr. Bashara believes the goal is to get them backing Kushner's peace plan with their wealth. He used the term cash cow in referring to the Arab states. So even though the trip is about getting backing for the peace plan, it is unlikely many of the details will be revealed to the public or even the Arab leaders just yet.
Now, Trump has said the U.S. will announce their full plan for peace after the elections have taken place in Israel. And looking at what's going on in Israel right now, Katan, that seems like it could be a turning point in Israel's future as well.
Well, Israel's Attorney General just announced that he plans to indict Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on corruption charges. As our viewers know, we've been following this situation closely, and this announcement comes just 40 days before Netanyahu's up for re-election.
Now, the Prime Minister denies the charges, calling it a political witch hunt. In a local interview, he said, "This house of cards will completely collapse. However, it does not look great for Netanyahu, who is facing charges on 3 separate counts, including offering bribes of regulatory benefits in exchange for favorable news coverage, allegedly trading legislation that would damage one newspaper for good press in another, and accepting gifts from a Hollywood producer totaling more than $250,000 in return for political favors."
Wow. Well, Netanyahu will have the opportunity to defend himself before the indictment is made official. He is calling the timing of this announcement undemocratic because voters are going to hear the charges before the election, but not the conclusion.
I could see why he would say that that would be bad timing on his behalf. Well, in retaliation for the death of Indian security forces just 2 weeks ago, India launched airstrikes close to the border of Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Now, it's the first military action since the worst suicide attack on security forces in India-administered Kashmir in decades. Now, the suicide attack took place on the 14th of February, leaving 40 soldiers dead. Jaish-e-Mohammed, a Pakistani-based military group, claimed responsibility.
India says their airstrike hit a large training camp of the Jaish-e-Mohammed group. However, Pakistan denies there were any casualties and says no training camp was hit.
An Indian Foreign Secretary spokesperson gave India's reasoning for the strike, saying, in the face of imminent danger, a preemptive strike became necessary. Now, he said the intelligence-led operation killed, quote, a very large number of Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorists, trainers, senior commanders, and groups of jihadis who were being trained were eliminated.
Well, he ended by stating the government of India is firmly and resolutely committed to taking all necessary measures to fight the menace of terrorism. Hence, this non-military preemptive action was specifically targeted at the Jaish-e-Mohammed camp, or E-Mohammed camp. Since the strikes, there have been violent confrontations between Indian soldiers and protesters living in Indian-administered Kashmir.
In Srinagar, Indian troops were firing tear gas at demonstrators. Now, the government also carried out raids on the homes of pro-separatist political leaders, which led to more violence. And now a curfew has been imposed in cities across the region.
Well, in answers to India's retaliation, Pakistan's foreign minister said its armed forces are prepared for all situations. The Pakistani foreign minister said, if there is aggression against Pakistan, we have the right to defend our country. This situation is unfolding at a political level, a diplomatic level, and at a military level. Pakistan is planning, and Pakistan will respond.
Well, Katan, we see that things aren't only heating up in Asia and the Middle East. We have the government of Venezuela still in a stalemate between two leaders, President Maduro and self-proclaimed interim President Juan Guaido. Now, because of the power struggle, speculation continues to grow over what will happen to the Latin American country's gold reserves and oil resources. Now, there has also been a lot of misinformation spread by the mainstream media.
One example was in the Wall Street Journal this week. They reported that Chinese diplomats were holding talks with Venezuela's opposition leader, Juan Guaido. Of course, this would be a very significant development because China is one of Venezuela's leading creditors, and along with Russia, is one of the key advocates for not interfering with Venezuela's domestic politics. But China says the Wall Street Journal's report is fake news.
Well, China's foreign ministry spokesperson said the relevant report is untrue. It is false information. To your question, I would like to say that recently Certain has kept churning out fake news. I don't know what their true intention. I hope relevant media will follow the principle of objectiveness and fairness in doing stories. Speaking of current issues on Venezuela, we call for a political settlement through dialogue.
The Wall Street Journal wrote, the talks are a sign of the apprehensions building with creditors of Venezuela's leftist government.
While Juan Guaido has extended an olive branch to China and Russia, Venezuela's two main foreign creditors, he has not held any talks with either country. He did, however, tell Reuters last month in an interview a change in Venezuela's government would favor the two countries. Now, of course, Catan, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves, and we know that China is the world's biggest oil importer.
That's right. Beijing has also been a key investor in the Latin American country, lending Caracas over $50 billion in a series of cash for oil agreements. Beijing's denial of any talks taking place between their government and Guaido's team shows China's unwillingness to abandon Maduro's government as of yet.
Well, following behind President Trump's recent State of the Union address, President Putin is now taking the floor to address his nation. YPN's Larry McGee has a report on the Russian leader's speech, followed by a story on the Pentagon. Larry?
The wait to see how President Putin would counter President Trump's State of the Union address is over, now that the Russian leader has delivered his State of the Nation speech to Russia's Federal Assembly. One of the key points of the address was President Putin's discussion on the state of relations between Moscow and Washington. The top diplomat believes that the issue is of critical importance due to America's recent exit from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. President Putin has asserted that America has been dishonest in its explanations as to why it actually decided to abandon the treaty, but President Putin believes that it was due to restrictions which limited the U.S. concerning missile production, but failed to involve and limit the activity of certain other nations. The Russian leader stated that he would have preferred for the U.S. to have been straightforward, but as it is, they violate everything, he stated, find excuses to put the blame on someone else, and then mobilize their allies who oink along with them. The leader said that Russia wants to have a proper, friendly, and equal relationship with the U.S. He stated further that Moscow does not pose a threat to anyone and that all of its actions have been in defense. In his address, President Putin conveyed that Russia does not want a confrontation, especially with a global power like the U.S. Nonetheless, the Russian head stated that Moscow will be forced to produce weapons that can be used not only against those territories where direct threats originate from, but also against the places where the decision makers are located. Mr. Putin commented that America should take into account the speed and range of Russia's prospective weapons, but he emphasized consistently that a bear only roars when it's attacked. The United States definitely appears to be in attack mode. If anything is to be gathered from its recent moves, like the change in strategy of its Special Operations Command, which is now reported to be shifting its focus from terrorist organizations to key nations like China and Russia. America's top military brass are downplaying the move, however, advancing the idea that the proposition really calls for a sort of rebranding, because America cannot continue to approach today's problems with conventional methods. The Pentagon's new strategy aims to pay more attention to cyber warfare and digital propaganda in explaining the command's thinking concerning the shift. Top military official Owen West stated that the nature of war does not change, but the character of war has changed radically over the last 15 years. With that in mind, America's Special Forces operations will focus on social media sites, discussion forums, and online communications for the purpose of targeting insurgent leaders, distributing misinformation, and recruiting proxy fighters and intelligence assets. America's largest competitors are sharpening their teeth in the game of information warfare as well, so that ultimately observers are wondering aloud if America's latest proposal is genuinely an effort to leave the war on terror behind, or is just the next phase of a global war with horrific consequences between itself and China and Russia. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
I guess it'd be interesting to see how these things unfold with the Pentagon's thoughts on what they consider international threats and how they're going to shift that focus towards Russia and China, which we know, as we just talked about not too long ago, they're also involved in that circle with Latin America, which the United States is trying to get, a foothold in. Maduro's, the Venezuelan government doesn't want anything to do with the United States. They want to keep the ties strong with Russia as well as China. And so, we've got a lot of things up in the air, so I guess we'll see how things play out as we move forward.
But that switch really doesn't come as that much of a surprise because so many top leaders have continually mentioned Russia and China as being United States' biggest concern at this point.
Right, and Russia dates all the way back to the time period of the Cold War, when Kennedy was in office, and the tensions between the United States and Russia kind of have hit a crescendo. They went to the tables, talked, things settled down, but I don't think they ever really became friends in the process. Right. Well, Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro has ordered the European headquarters of the state-owned oil company to relocate to Moscow. Venezuela's vice president visited Moscow recently, and she said, Ms. Rodriguez, in her speaking there, she said this move was a way of securing its assets, referring to the Venezuelan oil company's assets. She also said that this move is to strengthen our ties with Russia and that Europe hasn't given Venezuela enough assurance that it'll protect our assets. Look at the Bank of England, she continued, which is withholding Venezuelan gold. There has been an armed robbery with Venezuela, and we want to ensure our relationship with Russia.
At the same meeting in Moscow, Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Venezuela's legitimate government is ready for dialogue with the International Contact Group. Now, it is a great example of how Mr. Maduro and his government have taken a constructive position, and Guaido, who is backed as the head of state, is in violation of all norms and principles of the UN Charter.
Rodriguez also said that there's a concerted effort in seeking to justify an international intervention in Venezuela headed by the U.S. This is nothing new. We've seen these tactics in Syria and other countries. It is very clear to see what's going on. The U.S. is seeking to arm terrorist groups and rebels to destabilize and undermine our peace. The Venezuelan military and its people are united more than ever before. We will not become a second Syria.
Now, regarding the U.S., President Trump said that all options are on the table, including military intervention. Now, with this latest round of sanctions placed upon Venezuela, what we're seeing is an all-out assault on the country. Now, one of those sanctions is upon the state oil company, this in hopes to get the country to submit. Now, that company provides 90% of the country's revenue, and these sanctions amount to starving the country.
A military coup is imminent with more soldiers defecting. The hope of starving the people is, so that the people persuade the military to have a coup d'etat to take Maduro out of power, and then Guaido can take power. One priest spoke on the matter, saying the issue is not if Maduro falls. The real problem comes when the next 2 or 3 presidents come to take power, because to change the system from socialism to capitalism requires a return to imposing taxes and, once again, a demand for paying for public services.
Now, he continued, and since people are used to socialist system of assistance, so there will be civil resistance to a new government who tries to impose a capitalist system in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Now, Juan Guaido said that the first thing that he will do is take a loan from the IMF. And back in 1989, when the last U.S.-backed government tried to do just that, well, people rose up in protest, with as many as 3,000 people killed by Venezuelan security forces.
Well, Alfred de Zaya, UN special reporter, said that the problems in Venezuela is caused by an economic war that has been aggravated by the sanctions and the financial blockade. So if you try to asphyxiate a country, you're going to have sparsity, you're going to have people dying, and that's why I say sanctions kill. And it's that very mindset that we see throughout the governments of the world, where the people of those governments are suffering as a result of the choices of the leaders of the governments and wanting certain things from different countries, trying to kind of impose or force their way or their system of operating on different countries, when those countries have been doing just fine for many years without the interference or input from other countries.
Right, but it's really kind of a sly and cunning way to impose these sanctions on a country, knowing that the inhabitants there, they're the ones that are going to rise up, because they're the ones that are being starved, as the man said here. They're feeling the biggest, or taking the biggest brunt of these sanctions. So, it's a way of, hey, we don't have to send our military in here. Let's put the sanctions here, let them fight it out, let the people there in their own country fight against their government, and, in turn, this other nation there gets their hands involved in that country.
Yeah, and then they can easily say, hey, we didn't do this. This is what your people wanted. We're just coming to assist you. And so we see that many times taking place, like Vice President Rodriguez said, we saw these things, these tactics being used in Syria, which is currently being used here. And as some others have said many other times, even in different countries like Libya, for one. You know, the same thing. So Iraq was another one.
Yep.
So we just have to be on the lookout for these things as they unfold, because, of course, it has been taking place for many, many years.
Well, if you'd like to find out more about these stories and many others, you can contact the House of Yahweh, and when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. Here's how. To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at The House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website at YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can do so by emailing info@Yahweh.com. For any international calls, you can call the number that's on your screen now. And once again, don't forget 2 absolutely free, guaranteed, excellent Bible study tools on the market: the Yisrael Says program by going to YisraelSays.com, and the Ask Yisrael program by going to AskYisrael.com. You can answer any of your spiritual and scriptural questions that you may have by going there, typing it in the search, and page upon page of information will come up that will lead you to hours of studying and enjoyment.
Well, while the nations are sanctioning each other, trying to put harsh demands and penalties on other nations, we are actually being sanctioned to make an appointment before the Heavenly Father. Yisrael Hawkins in the House of Yahweh is here to offer you the words that bring forth truth. So don't go anywhere, because up next is Yisrael Hawkins bringing the way to peace and what you can do to be a part of it. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Hammerman.
Thank you for watching.